She ran to the Mafia boss on her wedding day to escape her toxic arranged marriage. Alessandra's white wedding dress tangled around her legs as she sprinted down the rain-soaked street in heels she'd already kicked off, mascara streaming down her face while her veil caught on branches and tore free. And behind her, she could hear her father's security team shouting for her to stop as she ran toward the only person in the city powerful enough to protect her from her family's wrath. She burst through the doors of Dante Romano's restaurant during the lunch rush, every eye turning toward the desperate bride who just destroyed a merger marriage that was supposed to unite two powerful families. And the maitre d' started to intercept her until Dante himself rose from his corner booth with an expression that shifted from surprise to dangerous interest as he registered who was running toward him with such raw desperation. Alessandra reached his table and gasped out words that would change both their lives forever, telling him she knew he hated her father and would do anything to undermine the Castellano family. So here was his chance, because she was refusing the arranged marriage and needed protection that only someone as powerful and ruthless as Dante Romano could provide. Stop everything right now. Before we go even 1 second further, I need to know where you're watching from. What city? What country? And what time is it there? Drop in the comments. Now smash that subscribe button, because what Dante says next is going to make your jaw drop. And when her father shows up demanding she come home, you are not ready for that confrontation. This story is about to get insane. Now let's get back, because Alessandra's father's men just walked through that door. Dante's dark eyes took in Alessandra's torn dress and bare feet and the desperation written across her face. And then he looked past her to where 3 of her father's security team had entered the restaurant scanning for their escaped bride. He made a decision in the space of a heartbeat, grabbed Alessandra's wrist, and pulled her into his booth while telling his own men in rapid Italian to politely escort her father's people out and make clear they weren't welcome. Alessandra watched Dante's security physically remove her father's men despite their protests about family business and stolen brides. And for the first time in hours, she felt like she could actually breathe because she was under protection of someone her father couldn't simply order around. Dante studied her while his men handled the immediate situation, taking in details that most people wouldn't notice. She wasn't just running from a wedding. She was running from something that had left finger-shaped bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes that went deeper than cold feet. He asked her very directly what exactly she was escaping and why she'd chosen to run to him specifically when she had to know his reputation was more monster than savior. Alessandra met his gaze with surprising steadiness given her circumstances and told him the truth. Her arranged marriage was to Riccardo Santini, a man 20 years older who'd been credibly accused of murdering his first wife, but her family had arranged it anyway because the Santini construction contracts were worth more than her safety. She tried to refuse, tried to convince her father that marrying her off to a probable murderer was wrong, but Antonio Castellano cared more about business alliances than his daughter's survival. She'd chosen to run to Dante because everyone knew the Romano and Castellano families had been rivals for decades, that Dante would relish any opportunity to humiliate her father, and protecting Antonio's runaway daughter was exactly the kind of insult that would damage her father's reputation while costing Dante nothing. Dante laughed without humor and told her she'd calculated correctly except for one thing. Harboring her would cost him plenty because her father would see it as an act of war and would retaliate with everything he had. Alessandra's face fell because she'd been so focused on escape that she hadn't fully considered the consequences for whoever helped her, and she started to apologize and stand to leave, but Dante caught her hand and told her to sit back down because he hadn't said no, just as she needed to understand the price of protection. He explained that if she stayed under his protection, her father would escalate from business rival to active enemy, that there would likely be violence and territory conflicts and maybe outright war. Her father would never accept the humiliation of his daughter, choosing Dante over the marriage Antonio had arranged, would see it as betrayal that required brutal response to maintain his reputation. Dante told Alessandra she had about 30 seconds to decide if freedom was worth that cost, if she was prepared to watch her choice trigger consequences that would ripple through both families and potentially get people killed. Alessandra looked at this dangerous man, offering her an impossible choice, and told him she'd already made her decision when she ran, that she'd rather trigger a war than marry a man who would probably kill her within a year, and if Dante was willing to protect her, then she'd find ways to be useful enough to earn that protection. Dante's expression shifted into something approving, and he told her that most people in her position would have begged or cried or tried to manipulate him emotionally, but she'd approach this like a business negotiation, understanding that protection required value exchange. He respected that pragmatism, even if it came wrapped in a destroyed wedding dress. He made a call and told someone to bring clothes and shoes appropriate for a woman Alessandra's size, then told her she'd stay in his personal guest house, where security was tightest and her father's people couldn't reach her. In exchange, she'd provide information about her father's business operations and upcoming deals, intelligence that Dante could use to undermine the Castellano Empire while keeping her safe from retaliation. Alessandra agreed immediately because trading information felt like poetic justice, using the business knowledge her father had shared, assuming she'd be a dutiful daughter to instead help his greatest rival destroy him. A woman arrived with clothes, and Dante directed Alessandra to his private office to change, and 20 minutes later she emerged in jeans and a sweater, looking less like a runaway bride and more like someone who'd just made the boldest choice of her life. Dante's Lieutenant Marco appeared and reported that her father's men were gathered outside the restaurant, but hadn't attempted to breach again, and that Antonio Castellano himself was en route, demanding a meeting with Dante immediately. Dante told Marco to let Antonio come, but keep Alessandra out of sight, then turned to her and asked if she was absolutely certain about this path, because once her father walked through that door and found his daughter under Romano protection, there was no going back. Alessandra nodded and told him she'd been certain the moment she realized her father cared more about construction contracts than whether his daughter survived her wedding night. Dante studied her face and told her she had more spine than most men in his organization, that running from an arranged marriage in a wedding dress took courage, but running to your family's enemy took a special kind of fearlessness that he found fascinating. Antonio Castellano arrived 30 minutes later with 8 men and a fury that made the restaurant's temperature feel like it dropped 20 degrees. He demanded to know where his daughter was, and Dante told him calmly that Alessandra had requested sanctuary, and he'd granted it, that she was under Romano protection now and wouldn't be returned. Antonio's face went purple with rage, and he told Dante this was an act of war, that stealing his daughter on her wedding day was an insult that demanded blood. Dante responded that he hadn't stolen anyone, that Alessandra had run to him of her own volition, fleeing a marriage that terrified her. And if Antonio had been a better father, maybe his daughter wouldn't have chosen his enemy over her own family. The insult landed like a physical blow, and Antonio lunged across the table, but Dante's men intercepted him before he could reach their boss. Antonio was screaming that Alessandra was his daughter and his property, and Dante had no right to interfere with family business. Dante told him very quietly that women weren't property regardless of what old-world thugs like Antonio believed, and that Alessandra had agency to make her own choices even if those choices humiliated her father. He told Antonio to leave and inform Riccardo Santini the wedding was canceled permanently, and that any attempt to retrieve Alessandra would be met with immediate violent response. Antonio promised revenge and destruction, swore that Dante had just signed his own death warrant, and started a war that would end with the Romano family eliminated. Dante smiled without warmth and told Antonio he'd been waiting for an excuse to destroy the Castellano Empire for years, and if Antonio wanted to start that war over a daughter he'd been willing to sacrifice to a murderer, then Dante would gladly oblige. Antonio left threatening and cursing while Dante's men ensured none of his security tried anything stupid on the way out. Once they were gone, Dante found Alessandra in his office, where she'd been watching through security monitors, and her face was pale but determined as she asked if he'd meant what he said about protecting her, even if it meant war. Dante told her yes, absolutely, that once he gave his word, he kept it regardless of cost, but she needed to understand that her father would try everything to get her back, including threats and violence, and attempting to turn other families against the Romanos. She needed to be prepared for her entire family to disown her, for her mother and siblings to be turned against her, by Antonio's narrative about ungrateful daughters and family betrayal. Alessandra said she'd accepted all of that when she ran, that she'd known choosing freedom over duty meant losing her family, but she'd rather be disowned and alive than dutifully married and murdered within a year. That evening, Dante brought Alessandra to his estate and showed her the guest house that would be her home for the foreseeable future. It was small but comfortable, with security that rivaled military installations, cameras and sensors, and guards who rotated shifts, ensuring nothing approached without Dante knowing. Alessandra looked around this space that represented both sanctuary and prison and told Dante she was grateful, even knowing this protection came with strings attached. Dante told her the strings were simple: provide intelligence on her father's operations, don't betray his trust, and stay alive, because her death would be seen as failure of his protection, and he didn't fail at anything. Over the next week, Alessandra settled into her new reality while the city buzzed with gossip about the runaway Castellano bride and the Romano boss who'd stolen her. Her father made good on his threats, spreading stories that Dante had kidnapped her, that she'd been brainwashed or coerced, anything to avoid admitting his daughter had chosen escape over the marriage he'd arranged. Riccardo Santini was apparently furious about the public humiliation and demanding compensation for the broken engagement, and the alliance between Castellano and Santini families had fractured under the weight of scandal and accusation. Alessandra spent her days debriefing with Dante about her father's business operations, detailing construction contracts and political bribes and money laundering schemes she'd overheard over years of being invisible in her father's house. Dante listened with intense focus, occasionally asking clarifying questions, building a comprehensive picture of the Castellano Empire's vulnerabilities. He told her the intelligence she provided was worth the protection she required, that she had a mind for business strategy her father had wasted by treating her as a bargaining chip rather than an asset. The evenings were stranger because Dante would often join her for dinner in the guest house, and they'd fall into conversations that ranged from strategy to philosophy to surprising personal revelations. Alessandra learned that Dante had inherited his position young after his father's assassination, that he'd spent years consolidating power and eliminating threats until he'd become untouchable. He asked about her life before the arranged marriage, and she told him about studying business in college before her father pulled her out, claiming she didn't need education to be a wife, about dreams of building her own company that had died when Antonio decided her only value was as a marriage pawn. Dante told her those dreams didn't have to stay dead, that she could build something here under his protection if she wanted independence beyond just escaping her father. The offer surprised Alessandra because she'd expected to be a kept prisoner, not an empowered ally, and she found herself looking at this dangerous man with new appreciation. He was giving her choices when her entire life had been about other people's decisions for her, and that gift of autonomy was more valuable than any protection his security could provide. 2 weeks after her escape, Alessandra's mother appeared at the estate gates begging to see her daughter, and Dante asked Alessandra if she wanted the meeting or if he should send Maria Castellano away. Alessandra's hands shook because she'd expected her father's violence, but her mother's grief was somehow worse, and she told Dante she'd see her, but only with him present, because she didn't trust herself not to cave to maternal manipulation. They met in Dante's formal sitting room with guards outside, and Alessandra's mother wept the moment she saw her daughter, reaching for her with trembling hands while asking how Alessandra could do this to their family, how she could humiliate them by running to the Romanos of all people. Alessandra felt her resolve waver under her mother's tears until Dante's presence beside her steadied her spine, and she told Maria that she'd run because the alternative was marrying a man who'd probably kill her, that her father had valued business deals over her survival, and she refused to die for construction contracts. Maria insisted that Riccardo was a good man from a respected family, and the rumors about his first wife were just rumors, that Alessandra was throwing away security and status because of gossip and cold feet. Alessandra pulled up her sleeve, showing the bruises from where Riccardo had grabbed her during their engagement dinner when he'd thought no one was watching, finger marks that were yellowing but still visible, and asked her mother if good men left bruises on their fiancés before the wedding even happened. Maria's face crumbled, and for a moment Alessandra thought her mother finally understood. But then Maria said that marriage required sacrifice and compromise, that Alessandra needed to be smarter about not provoking Ricardo's temper. And the words hit like a betrayal worse than her father's coldness. Alessandra told her mother to leave, that any woman who counseled her daughter to accept abuse for the sake of family reputation wasn't actually a mother, but a collaborator in violence. Maria left crying, and Dante told Alessandra quietly that he was sorry, that he'd hoped her mother would prove to be an ally, but some people were too broken by their own choices to save anyone else. The confrontation with her mother clarified something for Alessandra. She wasn't just escaping an arranged marriage, she was escaping an entire worldview that treated women as currency in men's business dealings. She told Dante she wanted to actually work for him, not just provide intelligence, but build something that demonstrated she had value beyond information about her father. Dante asked what skills she had, and Alessandra admitted most of her business education had been theoretical, but she learned fast and understood the construction industry intimately from years of overhearing her father's deals. Dante studied her and then made a call to his finance director asking if they had room for someone to learn the legitimate side of his operations, the property development and construction management that provided legal income alongside his less legitimate ventures. Within days, Alessandra was working in Dante's corporate offices, learning project management and contract negotiation from his director of operations, a sharp woman named Gabriella, who'd risen through merit rather than family connections. Gabriella was initially skeptical of the runaway bride playing and having a career, but Alessandra's work ethic and genuine interest won her over quickly. Alessandra threw herself into learning everything about construction project management, spending 12-hour days absorbing information and asking questions that demonstrated real understanding. She discovered she had an instinct for identifying cost overruns and timeline issues, could read contracts, and spot problematic clauses that would cause delays or disputes. Dante watched her transformation from desperate runaway to competent professional and felt something shift in how he viewed her. She wasn't just Antonio Castellano's daughter or the bride he'd sheltered despite a rival. She was someone with genuine capability who'd been systematically prevented from developing it. He started including her in business discussions, valuing her insights about construction contracts and competitor analysis. His lieutenants were initially resistant to taking direction from a woman who'd only been in the organization for weeks. But Alessandra won them over by being right repeatedly about project details and market opportunities they'd overlooked. The professional relationship complicated what had been a simple protection arrangement. Dante found himself seeking Alessandra's company beyond business necessity, sharing meals that stretched into evening conversations about ambitions and regrets and the strange circumstances that had entangled their lives. Alessandra discovered that Dante was more than the ruthless crime boss reputation suggested, that he read philosophy and supported community programs and had clear ethics about which lines he wouldn't cross even for profit. She asked him once why he'd really taken her in when it meant war with her father, and Dante admitted that he'd seen something in her desperate courage that reminded him of himself at 23, inheriting impossible circumstances and choosing to fight rather than accept defeat. The first kiss happened 6 weeks after her escape during a late night, working on a major contract proposal in Dante's office. Alessandra had found a solution to a permitting problem that had been stalling the project for months, and Dante's face had lit with genuine admiration that made her stomach flip. She'd leaned forward to show him the documentation, and suddenly they were inches apart, and the air felt electric. And when he kissed her, she kissed back with an intensity that surprised them both. They broke apart, and Alessandra told him this was probably a terrible idea, given the circumstances, and Dante agreed completely while pulling her back in for another kiss that made her forget every rational objection. They tried to keep the relationship quiet because Dante's organization wasn't ready to accept their boss sleeping with Antonio Castellano's runaway daughter. But his lieutenant Marco figured it out within days and pulled Dante aside for a conversation about optics and loyalty. Marco argued that the men accepted protecting Alessandra as a strategic move against the Castellanos, But if Dante was actually involved with her, it looked like weakness, like he'd been manipulated by a beautiful woman into starting a war. Dante told Marco that his personal life was his business, and the war with Antonio had been brewing for years regardless of Alessandra, that she'd just provided the catalyst for conflict that was inevitable anyway. The relationship intensified quickly with the kind of passion that comes from proximity and danger and a genuine connection. Alessandra moved from the guest house into Dante's private residence, and his people had to adjust to their boss being in a relationship for the first time since taking power. Some accepted it, and some whispered that Dante was compromised, that sleeping with Antonio's daughter was strategic disaster waiting to happen. The concerns proved prescient when intelligence revealed that Antonio was planning to use Alessandra's presence in Dante's house as justification for violence, claiming that Dante had kidnapped and brainwashed his daughter and that retrieving her required force. Dante increased security and prepared for escalation, but Alessandra felt crushing guilt that her freedom was about to cost lives. She told Dante maybe she should leave the city entirely, disappear somewhere her father couldn't find her so the conflict would de-escalate. Dante refused absolutely, telling her that running now would make everything she'd endured pointless, that she deserved to build a life on her terms, not spend years hiding from her father's vindictiveness. He told her Antonio's retaliation was coming regardless because the humiliation of her escape couldn't be tolerated in their world, and the only path forward was through the conflict, not around it. The attack came 3 days later during a legitimate business meeting at one of Dante's construction sites. Gunmen opened fire on the trailer where Dante and his project managers were reviewing plans, and only advance warning from an informant gave them seconds to take cover before bullets shredded the structure. Dante's security returned fire and the attackers retreated, but the message was clear. Antonio was escalating from threats to actual violence, and nowhere Dante operated would be safe. 2 of Dante's men were wounded and the construction site was destroyed, and Alessandra watched the aftermath feeling responsible for every drop of blood spilled because of her choice to run. Dante found her in his office staring at damage reports and pulled her against him, telling her this wasn't her fault, that Antonio's violence was his own choice, not something she'd caused. Alessandra said she'd triggered it by running to Dante specifically, that she'd weaponized herself against her father, and people were getting hurt because of it. Dante told her that agency meant accepting consequences, but not accepting blame, that her father's choice to respond with violence was his moral failure, not hers. He told her she'd chosen freedom, and he'd chosen to protect that choice, and both of them were strong enough to handle whatever came next. The retaliation was swift and surgical. Dante's people hit 3 Castellano operations simultaneously, destroying product and infrastructure, but carefully avoiding casualties because Dante wanted to send a message about capability, not start a bloodbath. Antonio lost millions in a single night, and the message was clear. Continued violence would be met with economically devastating response that would cripple his organization. The strategy worked, and Antonio pulled back from direct attacks. But the Cold War between families intensified with both sides maneuvering for advantage through legal and illegal channels. Alessandra proved invaluable during this period because she understood her father's psychology and business methods intimately. She could predict his moves and identify his vulnerabilities, providing intelligence that let Dante stay 3 steps ahead. Her family's complete disownment became official when Antonio publicly declared she was dead to the Castellanos, that he had no daughter, and anyone who acknowledged her would be considered an enemy. Alessandra received the news with surprising calm and told Dante she'd already grieved the loss of her family when she'd run, that the formal disownment just made explicit what had been true the moment she'd chosen escape over duty. For months after her escape, Alessandra discovered she was pregnant, and the news hit like a detonation that would reshape everything they'd built. She told Dante in his office late at night, while he was reviewing security reports, and watching his expression cycle through shock to protective fury to something tender was like witnessing an entire emotional evolution in 30 seconds. He asked if she was certain, and she showed him 3 positive tests, told him she was terrified and thrilled and had no idea how to protect a child in their world of constant threat. Dante pulled her close and told her their child would be the most protected person in the city, that he'd mobilize every resource and contact to ensure their family stayed safe. And the word family made Alessandra's eyes burn, because she'd lost one family by choice and was building another by accident, but this one she'd fight to keep. Marco's reaction was less enthusiastic when Dante briefed his core team on the pregnancy, pointing out that a child made them vulnerable in ways they'd avoided by keeping Alessandra's presence strategically ambiguous. Now she wasn't just Antonio's runaway daughter under Romano protection. She was carrying Dante's heir, which transformed her from temporary guest to permanent fixture in the organization's future. Marco argued this would enrage Antonio beyond previous levels because Dante hadn't just stolen his daughter, but had gotten her pregnant, the ultimate insult that suggested conquest rather than sanctuary. Dante told Marco he didn't particularly care about Antonio's feelings, that protecting Alessandra and their child was now the organization's priority regardless of political complications. The pregnancy changed security calculations immediately. Alessandra was restricted to Dante's estate and select secure locations, her movements tracked constantly by security that made her previous protection look casual. She chafed against the restrictions until an incident 2 weeks after announcing the pregnancy when someone took a shot at her car during a rare approved outing, the bullet missing her by inches but destroying the window beside her head. Dante's security neutralized the shooter, who turned out to be one of Riccardo Santini's men seeking revenge for the broken engagement, and the reality that people actually wanted her dead made Alessandra accept the security restrictions without further protest. Riccardo himself became a problem separate from Antonio's vendetta when he started making moves suggesting he considered Alessandra's escape a personal insult requiring direct response. Intelligence revealed Riccardo had been obsessed with possessing her since the engagement began, that he'd viewed the marriage as acquiring property he'd already claimed ownership of. Learning she was pregnant with Dante's child had apparently triggered a breakdown of sorts, Riccardo fixating on punishing both Alessandra for rejecting him and Dante for taking what Riccardo considered his. Dante recognized the threat of an unhinged rival and moved to neutralize it before Riccardo could organize something catastrophic. The solution was brutal and efficient. Dante's people gathered evidence of Riccardo's first wife's murder, documentation that police had overlooked because of Santini family influence, and delivered it to federal prosecutors along with proof of current trafficking and extortion operations. Riccardo was arrested on multiple felonies, and his organization collapsed as associates scrambled to distance themselves from his legal troubles. Antonio was furious because he'd been counting on the Santini alliance to pressure Dante, but with Riccardo facing life in prison, that partnership was dead. Dante told Alessandra that Riccardo would never threaten her again, that his legal problems were permanent and his organization had turned on him to save themselves. Alessandra asked how Dante had obtained evidence that police and prosecutors had missed for years, and Dante admitted that some of it might have been enhanced by his people to ensure conviction, that in a perfect world Riccardo would face justice for exactly the crimes he'd committed, but this world wasn't perfect, and sometimes you manufactured evidence to ensure bad people faced consequences they deserved. Alessandra struggled with a moral ambiguity before deciding she could live with it, that Riccardo had definitely killed his first wife and definitely would have killed her. So if enhanced evidence ensured he stayed in prison, that was justice, even if the method was imperfect. The pregnancy progressed with Alessandra working from home office coordinating Dante's legitimate construction projects remotely. She discovered she had a talent for large-scale project management, could juggle multiple timelines and budgets, while identifying issues before they became crises. Dante's finance director Gabriella became a close friend and mentor, one of the few women in the organization who'd built power through capability rather than family connection. Gabriella told Alessandra that she'd been skeptical initially about the runaway bride playing businesswoman, but watching Alessandra actually contribute value had changed her assessment completely, that Alessandra had the instincts of someone who could genuinely build something significant if given opportunity. The relationship with Dante deepened as the pregnancy advanced, moving from passionate affair to something more foundational as they discussed parenting and future and what kind of life they wanted to build together. Dante proposed on a quiet evening in their bedroom. No grand gestures or elaborate setup, just him telling her that he wanted their child to have parents who were actually committed rather than just cohabiting for convenience. Alessandra said yes while crying because 18 months ago, she'd been preparing for an arranged marriage that would probably kill her, and now she was choosing to marry someone who saw her as equal partner rather than acquired asset. They married in a small private ceremony with only Dante's core people present, Rosa officiating as a judge who owed Dante favors and was willing to perform the service discreetly. Marco stood as witness, looking conflicted about the whole situation, clearly worried about strategic implications, while genuinely happy his boss had found something beyond the organization. Gabriella attended as Alessandra's witness and told her afterward that she'd never thought she'd see Dante Romano smile like that. That marriage had transformed his face from dangerous to almost soft. Alessandra wore a simple dress instead of the elaborate wedding gown she destroyed running from her first wedding, and the difference felt symbolic of everything that had changed. Antonio learned about the marriage through his intelligence network, and his response was rage that manifested in economic warfare, targeting Dante's legitimate businesses with regulatory pressure and contract interference. Antonio had connections in city government that Dante's more recent power couldn't override, and suddenly construction projects faced permit delays and contract disputes that cost time and money. Alessandra recognized her father's methods in the obstruction and helped Dante identify which officials were being pressured or bribed, mapping the corruption that Antonio was weaponizing against them. They counterattacked by going public with evidence of the construction contract fraud that Antonio had been running for decades, feeding information to journalists and prosecutors simultaneously. The scandal exploded across media with details about bid rigging and safety violations and political bribery that implicated dozens of officials in Antonio's network. The coverage destroyed Antonio's reputation and triggered investigations that threatened his empire. And Alessandra watched her father's downfall through news reports, feeling complex emotions about weaponizing her knowledge against the man who'd raised her. Her siblings reached out separately from their father, her younger sister Bianca and brother Lorenzo, both asking if the allegations Alessandra had made were true. She told them, yes, absolutely, that she'd spent years overhearing deals that were clearly criminal and had finally decided protecting their father's reputation mattered less than stopping his corruption. Lorenzo called her a traitor who'd sold out the family for money and Dante Romano's protection. But Bianca admitted she'd suspected for years that their father's business was dirty and was relieved someone had finally exposed it. The split in her siblings' reactions reflected broader divisions in the Castellano family as Antonio's legal troubles mounted. The baby arrived 7 months after Alessandra's wedding day escape. A daughter they named Giulia after Dante's grandmother, who'd been the strongest woman he'd ever known. Alessandra went into labor during a crisis when federal agents were raiding one of Antonio's properties, and Dante was torn between being at the hospital and managing the fallout until Alessandra told him the raid was culmination of months of work, and he needed to be there to ensure it succeeded. She labored with Marco's wife attending as support, while Dante coordinated with prosecutors remotely, and Giulia arrived just as news came through that Antonio had been arrested on multiple felony counts. Dante made it to the hospital 30 minutes after his daughter was born and found Alessandra exhausted but glowing while holding their baby. He'd missed the birth coordinating his enemy's arrest, and Alessandra told him it was perfect timing actually, that their daughter had arrived at exactly the moment her grandfather went to jail for the crimes that had nearly gotten Alessandra killed. Dante held Giulia for the first time and told Alessandra their daughter would grow up knowing she was valued for who she was, not what marriage she could provide, that they'd build something different from the world that had tried to trap them both. Antonio's trial happened when Giulia was 4 months old, and Alessandra testified against her father despite his lawyers trying to block her testimony as biased. She sat in the witness stand and detailed years of criminal activity she'd witnessed, contracts she'd seen him manipulate and bribes she'd watched him pay, and the complete disregard for safety regulations that had gotten construction workers killed. Antonio stared at her with hatred so pure it was almost physical, and when his lawyer tried to discredit her by claiming she was lying to please her criminal husband, Alessandra told the jury that the only reason she knew enough to testify was because her father had never bothered to hide his crimes from a daughter he'd viewed as too insignificant to matter. The testimony was devastating, and Antonio was convicted on 12 counts, including fraud, bribery, and manslaughter related to construction deaths. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, and the Castellano Empire collapsed without his leadership. Various lieutenants fighting over remains while federal seizures claimed most assets. Alessandra watched her father being led away in handcuffs and felt nothing. The man who'd arranged her marriage to a killer had destroyed any familial bond when he'd valued contracts over her life. Dante asked if she wanted to visit Antonio before he was transferred to federal prison, and Alessandra said no, that she'd said everything she needed to say on the witness stand. Bianca reached out months after the conviction and asked to meet her niece, admitted she'd cut contact with their father after his arrest, and was trying to build a life separate from the Castellano name. Alessandra agreed cautiously, and they met at Dante's estate, where Bianca cried, holding Julia, and apologized for not being stronger sooner, for not supporting Alessandra when she'd run from the arranged marriage. Alessandra told her sister that everyone made choices based on the courage they had available at the time, that she didn't blame Bianca for survival instincts that had kept her safe. They rebuilt their relationship slowly, with Bianca becoming part of Julia's life, the one family connection Alessandra maintained from her previous world. 3 years after Alessandra's wedding day escape, the construction company she'd built under Dante's organizational umbrella had become one of the most successful in the region, winning contracts through competitive bidding rather than her father's methods of bribery and intimidation. She'd proven that ethical business practices could actually be more profitable long-term, that treating workers fairly and maintaining safety standards attracted better talent and produced superior results. Dante's legitimate operations had expanded significantly, with Alessandra managing the construction division, and his organization's reputation had shifted slightly from pure criminal enterprise towards something more complex that existed in both legal and illegal spaces simultaneously. The shift attracted attention from law enforcement, who couldn't quite figure out how to categorize Dante Romano's evolution from traditional crime boss to quasi-legitimate businessman with a wife who testified against her own father. Federal prosecutors approached Alessandra privately, asking if she considered providing information about Dante's illegal operations in exchange for immunity and witness protection. She'd listened to their pitch and then told them politely that she'd already chosen her side when she'd run to Dante's protection, that she wasn't interested in betraying the man who'd given her freedom and partnership when her own family had tried to sell her to a murderer. The prosecutors warned that loyalty to a criminal would eventually cost her, and Alessandra responded that disloyalty to family had cost her father everything, so she'd take her chances with the man who'd actually valued her. The approach rattled Dante when Alessandra told him about it, less because he doubted her loyalty and more because it meant federal attention was focusing on their family specifically. He'd spent years building walls between his legitimate and illegal operations to protect Alessandra and Julia from criminal liability, but federal investigators were skilled at finding connections others missed. Marco suggested they considered Dante stepping back from the illegal side entirely, transitioning to completely legitimate operations now that they had enough legal income to sustain the organization. Dante was resistant, because walking away from criminal enterprise meant ceding territory and power to rivals who wouldn't hesitate to fill the vacuum. The decision was forced when one of Dante's illegal operations went catastrophically wrong and 3 people died in a warehouse fire that was definitely arson meant to destroy evidence. Federal investigators descended with warrants and subpoenas, and suddenly Dante was facing potential murder charges related to the deaths, even though he'd had nothing to do with the arson. His lieutenant who'd been running that operation had panicked when he thought they were about to be raided and had started the fire to destroy product, not realizing people were still inside the building. The tragedy and the federal attention it brought made clear that maintaining illegal operations was no longer sustainable risk. Dante made the call to liquidate all criminal enterprises and transition entirely to legitimate business, a decision that shocked his organization and the broader criminal community. Associates who'd been with him for years protested that going legitimate meant losing respect and power, that rivals would see it as weakness and move against territories he'd controlled for decades. Dante told them that protecting his family mattered more than maintaining criminal empire, that he'd build enough legitimate wealth that he could walk away from illegal operations without financial hardship. Those who wanted to continue in criminal life could leave with his blessing and recommendations to other organizations, but anyone staying with Romano operations needed to accept the transition to legality. Half his people left within weeks, unable or unwilling to imagine themselves operating within legal boundaries. The ones who stayed were mostly those with families themselves who'd been looking for exit from criminal life but hadn't seen viable path. Dante worked with lawyers and accountants to restructure completely, divesting from anything that couldn't withstand regulatory scrutiny, accepting losses on assets that couldn't be legitimately explained. The transition was expensive and painful, but ultimately successful. And within 18 months, Romano Enterprises existed purely as construction and property development company, with no criminal operations remaining. The transformation affected Dante's standing in ways he'd anticipated but still struggled with. Former allies treated him with mixture of pity and contempt, viewing his choice to go legitimate as surrender to domesticity and federal pressure. Rivals tested boundaries to see if Dante had actually gone soft, probing territories he'd abandoned and operations he'd walked away from. Dante had to prove he was still dangerous even while operating legally, that choosing legitimate business didn't mean tolerating disrespect or threats to his family. He handled challenges with strategic precision rather than violence, using legal tools and business pressure to demonstrate that he remained someone not to be crossed. Alessandra watched her husband navigate this transition and fell even more in love with him for choosing their family over his empire. She told him one night that watching him walk away from power he'd spent years building was the bravest thing she'd ever witnessed, that most men would have clung to criminal authority rather than risk appearing weak. Dante said he'd learned from watching her that sometimes courage meant making choices others called weakness, that she'd been brave enough to run from an arranged marriage despite everyone calling her ungrateful and disloyal. And he was just following her example by prioritizing what actually mattered over what others expected. They had a second child 2 years after Giulia, a son they named Antonio in deliberate reclamation of a name Alessandra's father had poisoned through his choices. Dante had been uncertain about using that name, given its associations, but Alessandra insisted because she wanted to prove that names carried only the meaning their bearers gave them, that her son would make Antonio mean something honorable rather than corrupt. The baby was born healthy and loud, and Giulia took to being a big sister with bossy enthusiasm that made both parents laugh. The family attended Bianca's wedding when Giulia was 5, Alessandra standing as her sister's maid of honor in a ceremony that would have been impossible when Antonio still controlled the family. Bianca had fallen in love with a high school teacher who had no connections to organized crime and no interest in anything beyond building a quiet life. And watching her sister marry for love rather than arrangement made Alessandra cry with happiness for what they'd both escaped. Lorenzo didn't attend the wedding, still loyal to their imprisoned father and viewing both sisters as traitors. But his absence was relief rather than loss because some family connections weren't worth maintaining. Antonio was released on medical parole 5 years into his sentence, his health destroyed by prison and age and the stress of losing everything he'd built. He moved into a small apartment funded by whatever remained of his seized assets, a humiliating end for a man who'd controlled construction contracts worth hundreds of millions. Bianca visited him occasionally out of duty, but Alessandra refused all contact, telling Dante that the man in that apartment wasn't her father, that Antonio Castellano had died the moment he'd tried to force her into marriage with a murderer. Giulia asked once why she didn't have a grandfather on mommy's side, and Alessandra told her daughter honestly that sometimes family hurt you so badly that walking away was the only healthy choice. That love required reciprocity, and her grandfather had never learned to value people over power. The construction company Alessandra had built employed over 200 people and generated enough profit that Dante's organization thrived entirely through legal operations. She'd proven her father's methods were unnecessary, that ethical business could succeed without bribery or corruption if you were willing to work harder and smarter than competitors. Industry publications interviewed her about her success, and she gave carefully crafted responses that acknowledged her background without detailing the specifics, presenting herself as someone who'd learned business from family tradition but had chosen to apply those lessons ethically. The media loved the narrative of the crime boss's daughter who'd gone legitimate, even if they didn't know the full story of her wedding day escape. Dante's transformation inspired other criminal organizations to consider legitimate transitions, proving that exit from criminal life was possible for those with resources and determination. Federal prosecutors who'd spent years trying to indict him found themselves without viable targets as Romano Enterprises operated entirely within legal boundaries, and eventually they shifted focus to more obviously criminal organizations. Dante maintained relationships with some former associates who still operated illegally, but carefully kept those connections social rather than business-related, maintaining friendships without engaging in activities that could compromise his legitimate status. 10 years after Alessandra's desperate run through rain-soaked streets in a wedding dress, she stood at a construction site ribbon-cutting for a low-income housing development her company had built, a project that provided quality, affordable housing without the cost-cutting and corruption that had characterized her father's developments. Dante stood beside her with Julia and Antonio fidgeting in their formal clothes, and Bianca attended with her own children who were meeting their cousins. The mayor gave a speech praising Romano Construction's commitment to community development and ethical business practices, and Alessandra felt surreal pride that she'd built something genuinely valuable from the ruins of her father's corrupt empire. After the ceremony, Dante pulled her aside and told her he was proud of everything she'd built, that the terrified woman who'd burst into his restaurant seeking protection had transformed into someone who was changing their industry for the better. Alessandra told him she'd only been able to build any of it because he'd given her space to become something beyond her father's daughter or his arranged bride. That protection had been the foundation, but partnership had been what actually mattered. She said that running to him had been the most terrified and most certain she'd ever been about a choice. That desperation had pushed her through his doors, but instinct had told her he was someone who'd actually see her value. They drove home as a family with the kids arguing in the back seat and Dante's hand warm on Alessandra's knee, and she thought about the alternate life she'd escaped. If she'd married Riccardo Santini, she'd probably be dead within that first year. Another tragic accident covering a murder that everyone suspected but nobody proved. Instead, she was alive and thriving and building something meaningful. Mother to 2 children who'd grow up knowing they were valued for themselves rather than their utility in business arrangements. The cost had been her birth family and years of conflict and federal scrutiny. But sitting in that car with Dante and their children, Alessandra knew she'd made the right choice. Antonio died 2 years later alone in that small apartment, his remaining children notified by his landlord when rent went unpaid. Bianca attended the funeral with Alessandra accompanying for support, and they were the only mourners besides the priest performing the service. Looking at her father's casket, Alessandra felt nothing except relief that he could never threaten anyone again, that his particular brand of corruption and control had died with him. Bianca asked if Alessandra regretted anything, and she said only that she hadn't had the courage to run sooner, that maybe if she'd escaped before Riccardo's obsession deepened, someone else might have been spared his violence. They buried Antonio in an unmarked grave because even in death his name carried shame rather than honor, and Alessandra left the cemetery feeling lighter than she had in years. Dante asked her that evening if she was okay, and she told him she was better than okay, that the man who tried to define her entire existence was gone and couldn't poison any more lives. She'd built something better than anything he'd created, had raised children who understood ethics and family loyalty meant protecting each other, not exploiting each other, and that legacy would outlive anything Antonio Castellano had accomplished. Years later, when Julia was planning her own wedding to someone she'd chosen herself, Alessandra told her daughter the full story of that desperate run through rain-soaked streets and a man who'd given her sanctuary when everyone else had failed her. Julia asked if her mother had been scared running to a notorious crime boss for protection, and Alessandra admitted she'd been terrified, but more afraid of the alternative, that sometimes courage meant choosing unknown danger over certain destruction. She told Julia that the wedding dress she'd destroyed fleeing her arranged marriage was still in a box somewhere, a reminder of the life she'd escaped and the choices that had led her to everything that mattered. Sometimes the most terrifying choice becomes the most liberating one when you're brave enough to run toward danger rather than accept certain destruction. Alessandra traded her father's approval and a corrupt family legacy for the freedom to build her own life with someone who valued her capability rather than her compliance. She proved that walking away from toxicity, even when it costs everything familiar, can lead to building something better than you ever imagined possible. Smash that subscribe button if this story inspired you. Comment which moment hit you hardest. Share with someone who needs courage to make their own bold choice. The next story is dropping soon, and it's darker and more intense than anything yet.